Hello, world history students, and welcome to this screencast on Chapter 13 from Bentley and Ziegler's Traditions and Encounters, 5th edition. In this chapter, we see non English words in the title because this is world history. Dar al Islam refers to the abode or the world of Islam. So it's a phrase we can use that isn't confined to one geographic region because we'll see Islam across in Europe, North Africa, and a couple of different regions, three regions within Asia. So we call this the world of Islam because there's some similar things that are happening inside of it. So let's take a peek. The purpose of this screencast is to give students an idea of what they should look for when they're doing the reading, or to listen to when they're done so they can see if they've picked up some of the most important ideas. Does what I say sound familiar? Or both? So if you take a peek, in this time period in history, we're going to see continuities across three areas. So you should look for all three in this chapter. So you look for exchange networks, how that's an ongoing process. The spread of Islam itself is exchange. That's exchange refers to both trade and the movement of ideas and biological organisms, diffusions. We're going to see the diffusion of Islam, as an idea, a cultural practice, in addition to trade. There'll be a new state form. So it'll be new in the 600s. So before 1200, then it'll be a continuity into 1200. And that's the idea of a caliphate. So that's a word we'll need to define. That's an important word to know. And then you're looking for increased productive capacity. It's happening in two different ways, at least. One is related to agriculture, and the other is to business practices, or what we call commercial practices, ways of doing business. So you want to consider these three dimensions of Islam. Now, religion is an aspect of the cultural in terms of world history themes, but the religious part of that is so important in this chapter because Islam was a new religion in the 600s that I've highlighted it separate from the rest of cultural. You might hear the neighbor dog too barking in the background, so she sends her best. Great. Now, there'll be some contextual elements in Chapter 13 that for AP World History Modern students won't be as familiar because you may not have spent much time in the, chapters before Chapter 12. So just to give you a little idea of how this works. Islam was emerging after all the things here, classical era, so it means before 600 CE developments. So on the top picture here, you see the Eastern Roman Empire with one of the great Eastern Roman emperors, Justinian, in the middle in the royal purple, flanked by church and state. And on the bottom, you see a triumphal scene for the Persian Sasanian Empire, where the Roman emperor is kneeling before him after military defeat. There's a story, I forget if it's Sasanian or Parthian, but of a Persian emperor using the Roman emperor as a boost, like stand on his back to climb up onto his horse. So, an unsubtle symbolic act, if you will. So we have these two classical civilizations, and both of them going back deep into ancient times that Islam then would inherit things from. And in fact, the Arabian tribes that were part of the birth of Islam had in different ways aligned with different empires of these two empires, kind of tilted toward one or the other before the emergence of Islam. You'll see religious influences from Judaism, Christianity, and Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism is something you might not be as familiar with. It's an ancient religion that's not practiced much anymore because it was from Persia, which is today Iran, and today that's almost entirely Islamic. But it was an ancient monotheistic religion that probably influenced Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Plus, fire altars. It's pretty interesting to learn about. Most of the practicing Zoroastrians in the world today are in India, where they're known as Parsis. There will be legacies then from the Hellenistic trade. That's the Greek influence. The Eastern Roman Empire was Greek, plus there was Greek influence across the Southwest Asia, across the Middle East, and into Central Asia. And then Gupta was the last classical Indian empire. So they'll be Indian from the subcontinent of India, cultural influences there. So all these things are going to be playing into what's happening. You just want to be aware that the book will talk about those as contexts. So that's what context is, things that come immediately before or are happening at the same time as. So Islam, of course, is first and foremost a world religion. And there's going to be a lot of terms in the text. And so it's going to be kind of tough to figure out which ones are not the most important. I've pulled these out as things that are going to recur in world history. It's important to know that Muhammad, peace be upon him, is regarded as a prophet in Islam. He's not divine. It's not like Jesus in Christianity, or even like the Buddha, maybe more like the Buddha, but a lot of Buddhists kind of worship the Buddha, and no Muslims are going to worship Muhammad. That would be sacrilegious because Muhammad was a man, and Muhammad was a real historical person like Jesus. What Muslims believe is that he was God's final prophet. The PBUH, for peace be upon him, is a term of respect that Muslims write when they record Muhammad's name. Muhammad received the word of God, according to Muslims, and recited it. And then that recitation was written down, and that's the Quran. The Quran itself, reading it, just FYI, is not arranged in a thematic or chronological way. It's arranged by the size of the chapters. So it's not something that's meant to be read from beginning to end. It was assembled from things Muhammad said later and is studied and memorized by devout Muslims. But that you have the Quran. Probably as important as the Quran in determining Islamic behavior and law is the Hadith, which I don't have on here because it's a term you don't have to memorize. But those are sayings and actions attributed to Muhammad by later people, and to provide guidance for the faithful. And those things form the basis of Sharia, which is often referred to as Islamic law, but also kind of means the path or the way of doing things. One way to understand this is that Muslims, even if they didn't live in the same political community, they lived in different states, or some may have even lived in a state not governed by Muslims, would have followed the same law or ways of being. There's a lot of political stuff about this in the United States today. You should know, in terms of world historical terms, Sharia is just the code of conduct that Muslims follow. So it would be much like the rules within Judaism that devout Jews hold and follow, and many of which were adopted and followed by Christians, like the Ten Commandments. So it's not necessarily meant to be an alternate legal system, but it does provide a mold for ethical behavior. And what that meant is that Muslims, even if they weren't in the same country, just to say that again, would have the same values, and that facilitated business because the Sharia included things about contract law and business dealings. That meant that if one merchant was dealing with another merchant and they're both Muslims, they knew that they were following the same regulations essentially. And so it provided a way for early modern commerce. Mecca is the city where Islam began, and Medina is the city where Muhammad and his followers fled and established the first Islamic community. So those are very important places, and Muslims are required, if possible, to make a pilgrimage, or in Arabic, a Hajj, to Mecca in their lifetime. So Muhammad was an Arabic speaker and a member of one of the prominent Arab tribes in late antiquity or the early medieval period. And so a lot of these words then are in Arabic because of that. Okay. Dar al-Islam then is a religion. People, it's an area where people are following these same kind of religious practices, but it's also had a political meaning in medieval times. So the most important word on this page is caliph or caliph, and a caliph would be the head of something called a caliphate. So that is a word to know. So a caliph or caliph would be a person who was the successor to Muhammad. What's important here is to know that Muhammad was both a political and a religious leader. He claimed to have a revelation from God that would unite people who had been fighting each other. It was very much a message of unity. In fact, many of Muhammad's first followers were Jews and Christians, because in the core Islamic message, prayer, monotheism, ethical duty to less fortunate and other people, there's nothing that contradicts Christianity and Judaism. Now, over time, it evolved into being a separate tradition. So I'm not suggesting it's the same thing. But Just something to play around with in your mind. A lot of the first Muslims were actually Jews and Christians, or they had been polytheists, worshiping idols and different gods and goddesses in the city of Mecca. So Muhammad united these people in a spiritual practice of unity that was also a political community. So he was both a political and a religious leader. At his death, then caliphs followed, and the first four were all people who personally knew Muhammad, like they were alive at the same time. And they established then a caliphate. So the caliphate then would be a community for Muslims. Now, you might have heard of the split, or know from your own personal experience, between Sunni and Shia Muslims. And this goes all the way back to the 7th century over a split over who was the rightful successor to Muhammad. Now, the caliphates claim to be the rightful, governing as the rightful successors, and Sunnis represented the idea that the leader of the community should be somebody who best follows in Muhammad's teachings and ways, and Shia stressed that the person should be biologically descended from Muhammad. It's important to know that the first caliphs are not, or even into into the whole time, really into the 1200s for sure, past the 1400s. People who are claiming to be caliphs are basically claiming both, that they're rightly guided and that they are descended from Muhammad. But where Shiism comes in is the belief that as teachers of Islam, there's a different line of descended people who aren't political leaders as caliphs, but were teachers of Islam, like the religious side of Muhammad. And so then a conflict between those two will develop. For most of this time period, though, that we're looking at, that conflict is not playing out in military terms. It happens at first, and then you get the establishment of first the Umayyad and then the Abbasid caliphates. And that Sunni Shia split, which caused civil war shortly after the death of Muhammad, doesn't really pop up again for hundreds of years, like in a way that leads to military conflict. So the Sunni Shia conflicts that we see in the Middle East today are very modern phenomena. Okay. The other word that I've bolded on this page, they have caliphate, is the Abbasid caliphate. And these are the Umayyads, and then the Abbasids were dynasties where people were passing down, men were passing down the title of caliph or caliph to their successive sons and grandsons, like that. The Abbasid dynasty rules all the way until Baghdad, which you can see, get my pointer going right here, which was established as the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, was sacked by Mongols in 1258. So the Abbasid Caliphate lasts all the way up until there. So that crosses the 1200 threshold and could be part of something you would use in the AP test. The important thing to know is, and you'll kind of see from the map, that it's expansive, and I'll talk about the cosmopolitanism of it as we go forward. So Abbasid Caliphate is a term that could be a piece of evidence that you would use in an essay or short answer question in AP World History. Okay. Just going to leave this page be because I talked through that. You don't have to know these names for AP World History Modern. These are the first four caliphs, and then the assassination of Ali and the civil war that happened as part of the Sunni Shiite split. You don't have to know the names of any of the caliphs in the chapter, although you'll find it useful to know them just to kind of keep reading through the narrative, but you don't have to memorize them. But Sunni and Shiite, those would be vocabulary terms to know for the rest of the class. So it's also a commercial world. You'll read in the text about new crops that came in. This is one of the themes we're going to see in the succeeding chapters. Like in chapter 14, we'll see new kinds of rice that were coming into southern China that increased population. Then we get into chapter 18, there'll be bananas diffusing across the Indian Ocean. Starchy bananas that were used as a basic foodstuff in Africa. It'll cause population growth. So you're always looking for that, because more people is going to mean more business. More efficient agriculture is going to mean that there's more people living in town, and more people in town means more commercial activity. So it's this cycle. So you're kind of looking for that. You're also looking for the different things that are happening that increased trade. Islam was very friendly to merchants. Muhammad was from a merchant family himself, and his wife was very much involved in their business dealings, and she's a model person in Islamic memory as well. And so there's a lot of trade. And what I have on there um, in the equation are different things. And you might especially pay attention to finance. There's going to be some terms that you can use as evidence there in terms of how Muslim merchants financed and moved money and resources around. Okay. So these things are always important. Commercial techniques and agricultural production is sort of the material basis for society. So look for that. You'll recognize the picture when you do the reading, but one of the things that the Caliphates did is they maintained caravanserai, which is another great term. Which you should. That's a good term to get down on a flashcard or in your notes. And caravanserai were places where travelers in caravans could stay, and their animals would have a place, and they'd be sheltered from the winds that could happen in some of these um, more remote areas. In terms of going forward as a cosmopolitan, like citizen of the world thing, that's what cosmopolitan means, like cosmos, the world. Going to see that in the Islamic world, there were many classics were brought together and then translated into Arabic. This image here shows a library in Basra, which is today in Iraq. There was an even more famous library and translation center in Baghdad called the House of Wisdom, usually translated as the House of Wisdom. And because of the location and curiosity and support of the caliphs, a lot of learning from parts of the different parts of the world were brought together, translated, and then built upon. So the intellectual center of the Western Hemisphere at this time is in the Middle East. It's probably in Baghdad, like circa 1000. Not necessarily technical knowledge, because there you might want to go to China, like in terms of inventions and machinery, what we might call engineering, but in terms of literature, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, kinds of things that you would think of as like college subjects. That's Baghdad will be where it is because it's at the crossroads of all this knowledge. And in fact, later in what European historians call the Renaissance, when Europeans start reading writers like Aristotle again from ancient Greece, they're often reading translations in Latin that have been translated out of Arabic. So translated from Greek into Arabic, Arabic into Latin. Something probably gets missed in there. But this is important, and that word house of wisdom is an excellent piece of evidence to use and to pay attention to what that is. This picture is often used to represent the house of wisdom, but it's actually of a library in Basra, a different city in Mesopotamia. Okay. So as you go through, I think it's always useful to take a look at, what is it that you don't need to know? You don't need to know the names of any of the caliphs, like I said, but it is important to know that term, caliph and caliphate. There's a lot of names of Islamic scholars in here, and those might kind of fuzz together, but do be sure you know the phrase house of wisdom. There's also a lot of Arabic words, and you can see one here, Hajj, that I had on a slide already. So that's a good to know. The most important ones, I would say, again, Caliph and Sharia, and kind of understanding that as a moral code that transcends a lot of different activities, both what we might think of as religious and also state and commerce. All right. So happy reading, kids, or if you've read, I hope that it went well. And you can use this to keep track of what's maybe most important and what you can use going forward. All right. Bye-bye.